Hello, welcome back. Today we're going to talk about minerals. We're going to focus on the major minerals. These are minerals found in larger amounts. Then in a subsequent lesson, we're going to talk about the trace minerals. These are minerals that are required in only very small amounts. Minerals are inorganic elements. They always retain their chemical identity, so they can't be destroyed. And the body will absorb them in quite complex fashion using usually protein carriers. So bioavailability is quite complex for most of these minerals. In a 60 kilogram human being, someone who weighs around about 132 pounds, you'll find the largest major mineral would be calcium and phosphorus found in the bones. Then we have potassium, sulfur, sodium, chloride, and magnesium. These are all of the major minerals. Let's start with sodium. Sodium is a major mineral. It's found in a lot of processed foods. You can find it in things like potato chips, crackers, popcorn, anything really that is highly processed. In general, the US population eats too much sodium, but I'm going to talk through the athlete's needs for sodium, which are considerably different from an average person. So, to summarize, sodium is the major cation found in the extracellular fluid that's outside of cells. It regulates blood volume. It's really important for regulating blood volume. It's also important for nerve transmission and for muscle contraction. Sodium travels freely throughout the body in the blood, and if you have too much sodium, your kidneys will eliminate it. Athletes need sodium, and the amount of sodium that they need will depend on a number of factors, including the temperature and their sweat rates. So let's take a look at it. The USDA suggests that recommended dietary allowance for sodium is only 2,300 milligrams per day. That's about 1 teaspoonful. An average American exceeds this number and has about 3,400 milligrams per day. Now, an athlete, depending on their work rate and how highly they sweat and the salt content of their sweat, may need more sodium each day. But when they're not working out, 2,300 milligrams per day would be the target for athletes as well. Salt and muscle cramps is a complicated story. Many athletes believe that salt will prevent cramping. However, there are a number of studies that show that salt alone is insufficient to prevent muscle cramping in endurance events. Essentially, the results are showing that it's much more complicated than just sodium. Potassium, calcium, magnesium are all important, as is neuromuscular training, that is, training your neurons to fire over and over again. Sometimes cramping is the result of neuromuscular exhaustion that would be undertraining rather than any kind of sodium or potassium imbalance. So how is fluid balanced within the body? As I was saying, about 2/3 of the fluids are inside of cells, and that fluid balance is regulated by something called the sodium-potassium pump. This is an energy-requiring pump in the cell membranes. It requires adenosine triphosphate, ATP, to function. So let's take a look at the sodium-potassium pump. This is more or less the action of a sodium-potassium pump. 3 sodium molecules are pumped from the inside to the outside of the cell, and 2 potassium molecules are pumped to the inside of the cell. This creates an electrochemical gradient, which can be released to move ions like magnesium and calcium across the chemical gradient to aid with neuron firing and muscular contraction. So this is really essential that we pump sodium outside of cells and potassium inside of cells. For this reason, you need a diet that's high in potassium to balance out the naturally high sodium diet that most Americans have. So you want to be focusing here on getting potassium-rich foods into your diet. In terms of fluid and electrolyte balance, it is important not to drink too much water during your sporting event. If you drink too much water, you can get low blood sodium, which is called low natremia sodium. Low blood sodium is a potentially lethal condition, and so you want to be extremely careful not to drink large volumes of water during a long sporting events and getting hyponatremia. It is also important not to drink too little during your sporting events. If you become dehydrated, that is a loss of body weight of 1 to 3% through loss of water. Typically, those losses occur through sweat. That results in a loss of sodium ions and loss of performance. Ultimately, dehydration can also be dangerous and lead to death. So sweat losses are going to be incredibly important for athletes, and later in this course we're going to do a section where we look just at measuring sweat losses and understanding sodium losses so you can always remain in electrolyte balance. Potassium is the principal intracellular cation. You need about 1,600 to 2,000 milligrams per day. This is quite a high number, and you can find most of this in fruits and vegetables. If you are lacking potassium, you can see increases in blood pressure and increased sensitivity to dietary salts. Potassium intakes, potassium can be found in fruits and vegetables, so we want to emphasize fruits and vegetables in our diet and try to keep the sodium intakes in balance with high potassium intakes. This takes a look at what happens when manufacturers process foods in terms of their sodium and potassium content. If we take something like milk, unprocessed whole milk, when it is processed into a product like instant pudding, you can see immediately that the sodium content is raised and the potassium content is decreased. Roast beef becoming chipped beef, the sodium content is huge, the potassium content is decreased. Fresh corn has a lot of potassium, it's very good for you, but canned corn, high in sodium content, low in potassium content. Fresh peaches, very good for you. Peach pie, again, high in sodium, low in potassium. And rolled oats, high in potassium, but oat cereal, high in salt. So we want to be focusing on these unprocessed foods to get the potassium we need in our diet to balance sodium from any other sources of processed foods. Athletes tend to lose sodium and potassium via sweat. Athletes may need more sodium than the recommended dietary allowance depending on their sweat rate and how much sodium they are losing during training. This is very athlete dependent and also dependent on environmental conditions such as temperature and humidity. Athletes definitely need more potassium in their diet than regular folks, again, because of sweat losses and also to balance their increased sodium needs. So losses of sodium and potassium are unfortunately very athlete specific, but we can do some things to estimate our sodium and potassium losses, and in the section we're doing later on electrolytes and hydration, we'll look at specific measurements you can make to estimate your sodium and potassium needs on a daily basis.